Hello and welcome to this edition of On the Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer, and for this episode we are coming to you on location from Grand Bahama. Tonight we delve into the origins of Freeport, a city which in some ways began to develop long before majority rule or even independence. 70 years ago, the Hawksbill Creek Agreement was signed, which birthed the Grand Bahama Port Authority. That organization over the decades has been responsible for a number of significant developments here in Freeport and a level of prosperity here in the city as well, and by extension, the island of Grand Bahama. Tonight, in the first of a two-part series, we sit down with a lady who in many ways has dedicated her life's work to this organization and to this island. Our discussion begins on the other side of this break. When American businessman Wallace Groves purchased the Abaco Lumber Company in Pine Ridge in 1946 for £50,000 and sold it in 1954 for $4 million in cash, he used the profits to develop Freeport. The following year, the Hawksbill Creek Agreement was signed by Groves and the government to establish the city, a free trade zone in Grand Bahama. The new Grand Bahama Port Authority would develop the city and the port of Freeport, exempt from income, capital gains, real estate and private property taxes until 1985. That was extended for a further 49 years to 2054. When the PLP won the majority rule in 1967 and again in 1968, the Hawksbill Creek Agreement was a source of contention for the new government. The 1968 White Paper on Local Government suggested decentralized government from Nassau. The Hawksbill Creek Agreement was identified as an exception. On July 26, 1969, Lyndon Pinling gave his famous bend or break speech at the opening of the Borco refinery. In part, he said, Bahamians are nevertheless still the victims of an unbending social order, which, if not now refuses to bend, must be broken. Freeport's original concept as an international trading post began to diversify with the construction of the Lucayan Beach and the Bahamas Princess hotels. In the 60s, established the island as a premier tourist destination. The 70s saw a surge in industry, cement manufacturing, bunkering terminal, and the Bahamas Oil Refinery Company. When Sir Jack Hayward and Edward St. George took over the Port Authority in 1976, they made a son of the soil, Sir Albert Miller, president. 2 years later, the three bought out Wallace Groves and ushered in what is described as a remarkable growth period over the next 25 years. At Sir Albert's retirement in 2003, St. George said, in those 30 years, he has done more than fulfilled our expectations. Without him, we could not have achieved what we did. Freeport hit another growth spurt in the 1990s under Hubert Ingram's Free National Movement government. The Maritime Centre, Container Port, Freeport Harbour, Bradford Marine, the Grand Bahama Shipyard, the Lucaya and Pelican Bay resorts opened in that period. Unfortunately, the 2000s delivered a series of devastating hurricanes to Grand Bahama, which have helped to stunt the island's economic growth. Francis, Jean, Wilma, and more recently, Dorian. Well, we begin the show with the legacy of the Port Authority, and I am honored and pleased to have with me on set this evening the daughter and co-founder of the Grand Bahama Port Authority, Sarah St. George. Sarah, thank you so much for agreeing to this today. We are ecstatic. Any excuse for me and my team to come to Grand Bahama, and so we were just very happy to be here and happy that you've agreed to sit and have this conversation with us today.
Well, we'd like you to move here. Just come here.
So you've made it
You
very
want everyone
difficult.
to move here.
You've made it very difficult for me now to say to my team, let's go back to Nassau.
You might as well stay the whole weekend.
So we're going to begin really by you sharing with us your father's vision for the Grand Bahama Port Authority when he first became involved. And how do you think that your father's leadership helped to shape the development of this area known as Freeport?
That's a very good question. He didn't just arrive in Grand Bahama. He initially went to Nassau in 1956 as chief magistrate, and I went with him. So I was in a pram at the time, but that was my introduction to the Bahamas, and he spent quite a few years on the bench in Nassau with future nation builders and leaders surrounding him in court, like Sir Lyndon Pindling, then known as L.O. Pindling, and many, many of the great figures of the Bahamas history, the history of this independent nation going forward, became his friends from very, very early on. And some years later, the whole family went back to England. Sadly, my mother died very young, and my father joined the United Nations, worked on peace treaties, worked all over the world, and then found himself drawn back to the Bahamas. It was the place that he felt most at home. It was the place he loved most. And everybody in the Bahamas were his friends and the people that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with.
So he really loved the country.
He loved it.
And
he loved it. He used to say to me, he used to say often, he used to say to all of us, I'm going to throw my passport away and just stay here, and nobody can ask me to travel anywhere or go anywhere else.
What was it, though, that you think drew him to Freeport, well, to Grand Bahama, and certainly to the area we now know as Freeport?
Initially, he was working for Sir Charles Hayward, who was Sir Jack Hayward's father, and who was one of the original founders of Freeport, and not a signatory of the Hawksbill Creek Agreement, but part of the formation of the Hawksbill Creek Agreement and Freeport as a city. There was Sir Charles Hayward, there was Wallace Groves, and there was Charlie Allen of a very well-known New York investment bank called Allen and Company, and those were the three initial founders of the city that came up with the idea of developing an island that was, well, you heard it a lot, but it was a kind of wilderness. I mean, there were no roads. There were no rail services. There were scattered settlements, and they had this vision that it should become a city, and that it was wonderfully located, and there's all sorts of potential to grow this island into something magical. And so through Sir Charles Hayward, my father came back here, but initially he didn't come into the Grand Bahama Port Authority. He came to form a law firm with Ruby Nottage. And that's what happened in the early 60s. They had a law practice here in Freeport, and then gradually he came to get more involved with the Port Authority as changes were happening. There were some restructuring actions that took place, and he then was asked by Sir Charles to take a greater role with the Port Authority. And then Sir Charles's son, Jack, came to be involved, and gradually that developed into the Jack and Edward St George partnership that we saw for decades. But it was an evolution.
So all of this is happening now. The city of Freeport, as we know, is being birthed. He, along with Sir Jack, are really the drivers behind this. And you're witnessing all of this. Take us to some of those pivotal moments that you recall that really helped to impact the economy of Grand Bahama, because as you rightfully said, there was really nothing here, and then suddenly the city is starting to build over time. What are some of the things that you remember, whether as a young girl or an adolescent or beyond, that you thought, you know what, this has really impacted or been really good for Grand Bahama?
Well, I was very young. I was growing into my teenage years. So, in fact, I would be sent back to boarding school in England. And mostly what I observed was during the school holidays. But when I was home, and in those days we lived at 11 Greening Glade, and it was a gathering point for so many, and that's what I remember as a child. That there was always somebody there was always a group in the house, and again. The founding fathers of the nations, Sir Lyndon, as Elo would be in the house. There would be a lot of laughter. Lady P, as we called her, the Monique, Michelle, Obi, all of the family were around many times, and I just remember it being a very, very happy time and hard-working time. Obviously, many transitions and in a way teething problems for everyone, but they enjoyed it.
If I could jump in for a moment, that's a little different narrative that history sometimes paints between Sir Lyndon and your late father and what was happening in Grand Bahama. And I think it goes back primarily to that bend or breaks speech, that very famous speech. But it all, in some of my reading and research, it seemed that there was an adversarial relationship.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because actually that came first. You have to remember that the time of the bend or break speech, the Grand Bahama Port Authority was a very, very different entity. This was before my father became involved, before Jack became involved. It was very much of a foreign entity that had come in to invest capital and to develop the whole commercial and industrial and tourism side of the island. But it was actually even a public company. It was traded on the New York Stock Exchange in those days. And that's why there was a feeling after Sir Lyndon came to power, after independence, that it had become too foreign. Mm-hmm. It wasn't an integral part of the Bahamas in the way that Sir Lyndon envisioned it. And having my father suddenly become involved gave him, I think, the reassurance that this could change, that there was a role for it.
So that's where the Bahamianization began.
That's when it started. So when my father first, let's say, got his foot in the door, before he was at the helm, you could say that more than 95% of the licensees were foreign. They were foreign businesses. The people who worked in the Port Authority were foreign. And then my father, who had such a love of the Bahamas, his mission, and it was his lifelong mission, was to really celebrate the talent that was in the Bahamas, and that it didn't need to be foreign. So gradually the whole Port Authority became Grand Bahamian, or everyone who worked here.
They brought
Grand
in
Bahamian.
They brought in
not just Bahamian, but Grand Bahamian. Right today, you know, there's not a single work permit in the whole organisation. It is Grand Bahamian, and the licensees that were in the very early days, 90% foreign, over 95% Bahamian now. So that was the transition, was saying, well, actually, the Grand Bahama Port Authority will be Bahamian.
A central figure in that, from my research, was the late Sir Albert Miller.
Exactly. And really, you think of them as a trio. Everyone has photographs and has images of Jack, my father, Sir Albert. They were the three co-chairmen. But don't forget also, there was a fourth pillar, which was Willie Moss, who was the vice chairman and president, and she was always part of the landscape. So, yes, indeed, you know, so you know, you can't, obviously, you've got to build a team, and you need wonderful minds and that passion to help realize a vision. And my father, I think he knew that, and he just gravitated immediately to people like Sir Albert, people like Willie, calm, sensible, Ruby Nottage, very, very bright. And he always, I think, spoke to, whether it was Kendall Isaacs or all the powers that be in Nassau, he always consulted. And no step was ever taken without the blessing of the government.
So I want to talk about those steps. So as we are, you know, talking about the Bahamianization of the Port Authority, some other things are happening. The infrastructure is being built. There are some things that are being, the foundation and the building of the city is happening. And take us through what that period meant and how we are still seeing now the fruits of that labor so many decades ago.
Well, I think the initial buildings and infrastructure came in very, very fast. It started, obviously, with the dredging of the harbour and building a harbour that was large enough to make it a trading seaport. And then with that, you build a community from scratch. So in those days and going forward, we kept the tradition going, even though it was not, you know, today is not part of the Hawksbill Creek Agreement, but building schools, making sure there was a good functioning hospital, building the airport, building a lot of the social infrastructure. When I say that, I mean sort of public buildings like the Sir Charles Hayward Library, the Yacht Club, the Sports Centre, Jack brought in the YMCA, the Salvation Army, the charitable organisations also to have a presence here, and just obviously something to make the community fun. So wonderful restaurants, nightclubs, places that people could go and relax.
It really was the Magic City.
Well, yes, it was. And you've got to remember back then, I remember well, it was, we really didn't have television. We certainly didn't have iPhones and an internet. So you couldn't sit and look at a screen for hours and hours as we did. You needed to socialize a lot. And a lot of the relaxation time was spent in groups of people.
And people from Nassau came.
They came
and
a
other
lot.
Places
Yeah.
came to enjoy Freeport. I remember,
Yes.
I'm going to tell my age, as a young boy
Yes.
in the 70s, coming for events and functions and family events. We came to Freeport.
Yes. And I think, you know, when I say evolution, we don't exist here in a vacuum. So the events of the world are always playing a part in how the economy is functioning and how Freeport develops and does stay. So back then, people came here also for the casinos. So the hotels that were built had a very exciting casino element to them, and people would fly in from America just to be able to play roulette and gamble. And that made it a kind of mecca. It also happened around the same time as Cuba had its revolution and changed, and therefore a lot of the people who had in prior times gone to Cuba for their fun were looking for somewhere else to go, where they could legally be in a casino. And so in a way, Freeport back in the day became that kind of mecca, and then that changed. So once in America, gambling was legalized, casinos opened in the United States, that really changed in many ways. It changed the way Freeport had to be seen. It's constantly had to reinvent itself. There had to be something different to gambling. There had to be a lot of emphasis on commercial, industrial, tourism, but it wasn't only going to be about. It wasn't going to be that easy situation that it had been earlier on, where everyone was just dying to get on a plane in the middle of the night and fly over here and fly back at 6 o'clock in the morning. They were called gambling junkets in those days. And it's a good thing, because my father was never really very comfortable with gambling and casinos. He preferred to lay a much more solid foundation.
Let's talk about now your involvement and how did you find yourself becoming so involved with the Port Authority?
It wasn't something that I grew up with in terms of, one day I will be working for the Port Authority.
So you weren't the heir apparent to take over.
No, I'm sure my father didn't think much of mortality anyway, so he wasn't thinking in that way himself. That's why there was a bit of chaos after he died. But he just wanted us to fulfill our potential as children. So he wanted to make sure that we were concentrating on our education and that we were striving to find our way in life, wherever that would be. But inevitably, he steered me, not all. After I had a, which I can tell you, but I had a very bad accident here in 1973 when I was 18, and I think my father used to say to me, well, you've lost an arm, but you still got another arm, and you've got a head, so use it. And during that time, I think he made up his mind that it would be a good idea if I followed some of his footsteps, studied law, for example, learned about banking and finance. And so that's what I did. I became a barrister. I was called to the bar. And then I went to JP Morgan in New York and was on Wall Street for quite a few years. And when my father died, suddenly, we really weren't expecting it. I had hoped he would really go on into his 90s and he'd go on forever. But when he died, it was a tremendous wake-up call. And I realized that, in a way, I owed it to him and to his lifelong work here to see if I could come and not ever be able to truly fill those enormous shoes, but play my part in the continuity, in understanding the vision that he had, in having the same sets of values and morals, and really believing as well that this was home. And I came back. I came back shortly after he died and made a point of moving here. He said something else to me. He said after my accident, when everybody thought I was actually going to die, he said he got such an outpouring of support and warmth and love from everyone here that he said, I made up my mind that if you survived, he said, I was really going to dedicate all of my life to Freeport and Grand Bahama. Now, when he said that, and having done that, how could I not? How could I not come back?
How could you not answer the call?
How could I not answer the call? So that was what brought me here.
I wanted to really also now talk about what happened following his death. You admitted that it was an untimely death. You did not see it coming. But as a result of that death, there was a legal dispute between the families of Edward St. George and Sir Jack Haywood. I want to talk about really what those legal battles did and how it affected the Port Authority and possibly even the Freeport community.
Well, of course, it's all water under the bridge now. It was 20 years ago, and it's amazing, that it's been 20 years since he died, because sometimes it seems like yesterday because I live with him. I live with him every day. He's present, and I think that's another reason I love being here, because I feel his presence.
Even around us in this very
actually,
office.
It's like he never went.
Yes.
But I think what's so valuable in life is a stability, a continuity, and when somebody who's sort of larger than life, like my father, is suddenly removed from the scene, it causes a tremendous imbalance and uncertainty and sadness. And I think during all of that, people were vulnerable to falling into the hands of the wrong kind of advisor. And unfortunately, it was necessary to, at that point, my father and Jack had never really felt it necessary because, they worked on a gentleman's agreement and a handshake and a man's word was his bond, and there was no need for too much complicated documentation. And so there was confusion as to how to register the 50-50 partnership. And that became problematic. And that led to, sadly, litigation, which I don't think ever solves anything, really. I mean, we need it. We need the law and we need justice. And sometimes it's inevitable. But it's unfortunate, and it was something that was needed to be resolved as quickly as possible, and then to move on from it. And actually,
you did.
Do you know what we did? Because once I was here full time, that meant I was 20 feet away from Sir Jack, who was in the office just on the other side of the little kitchen there. So we started to build our own bond, because Sir Jack didn't know me like that. He was still missing my father. But once we came to spend a lot of time together, and as always, sometimes, you have business meetings and it's about, it's a very structured setting, but, being together in an unstructured setting, having lunch together, sharing a joke, just talking about the old days, that helped rebond and heal anything that had happened in that unfortunate. And very quickly, Sir Jack said, well, I need to ask my partner, Sarah, and the family, you know, and we started to find our way again. It was lovely.
I want to use that now for us to really transition to some of the highlights and some of the memorable things and accomplishments that you have been able to achieve in your, I think, 14 years in working in this role. Mm-hmm. And what are the things that have stood out to you, the developments that you have seen that you are most proud of?
Well, it occurred to me the other day that I'll be coming up to my 70th year in 2025, and that is when the Hawksbill Creek Agreement was signed. So I'm exactly
well, congratulations!
Exactly the same
fantastic.
age. I knew that the first thing that I had to do when I came here was to encourage and bring consensus, bring the team together, because honestly, nobody can do anything without a wonderful team behind. You see them all today, but you know, Ian and Deanne Seymour and Carla and all, and Willie was then to bring the team together, to get the best process for where we were going. And so that initially it was about methodology and, as always, what we call putting out fires. You see the problems, you solve the problems. There's another problem, you solve the problem. But very quickly I realized, now we've got to get beyond that. Like recovering from a hurricane, where are you going to go next? And so the thing I was most focused on and very proud of was when we started to move towards the new Carnival cruise port, Celebration Key. And I was so excited suddenly when I met an old friend of my father's, Giora Israel, who at that time was a senior vice president of Carnival Corporation. And he said, we would love to have, I talked about it with your father, we would love to have a cruise port which brings our cruise passengers into an actual beach. And he said, and I said, shall we do it in Freeport? Shall we do it for Freeport? Make it Bahamian. And that was the beginning of something that now just is so exciting to witness. It took from 2017 to 2022 to actually get that over the line. It's not an easy thing, as you know, putting a big project together. It needed about 65 permits, some from us over the land, and then many over the below the high water mark, of course, is all the government. So we had to work very closely together. And Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Tourism, Ministry of Works, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Fisheries, all of that. And so I worked day and night to keep that project on track, despite the hurricanes. Well, despite COVID.
This brings us, and I think you must have seen my question. This brings us now to, I think, our next major point of discussion, and that is those challenges. The challenges that have faced Grand Bahama over these many years, the consistent hurricanes, the economic downturns, as well as more recently COVID. And of course, within that hurricane discussion, Hurricane Dorian, which was so devastating. But, those challenges in these years have really, dealt blow after blow to the Grand Bahama economy, to the Grand Bahama people. But you're still here. And you're still in the game.
Yes. And I think that that is really what these things are all about. Nothing comes easily. There always are going to be setbacks, and I think it was St. Augustine who said, faith is believing in a vision, and faith's reward is to see that vision realized. So you just have to keep the faith, and you have to be adaptable. And I mean, I probably learned some of that with my accident. You know, there were never any why me moments, or my father certainly wouldn't have allowed me to what he called feel sorry for myself. So the whole attitude of just getting on with it, putting one foot in front of the other, dealing with whatever comes to throw you off course, and doing your best, because you know, it's sometimes in your darkest moment you can be just on the verge of enlightenment or the breakthrough. You never know, and so you cannot allow a defeatist attitude to come in.
Let me ask you, do you feel that Grand Bahama is on the verge of that breakthrough?
Yes,
now?
I do.
Why?
Well, because we've had the battering, and we're now actually at the 5th anniversary of Hurricane Dorian, believe it or not, already 2019, 2024. So the rebuilding is happening. Initially, it was recovery, repairs, relief, and now with these new projects, and I think the maritime sector, Jermaine, we're very fortunate that we can tap into, let's say, the fastest growing tourism industry in the world, which is the cruise industry. To have this new port that can bring 10,000 people a day to within 1,000 feet of our beautiful beaches, to have Carnival that owns some, I think about 11 brands: Holland America, Princess, Carnival Cruise Lines, Seabourn, many brands. To have them already coming back just 2 years later to say they're going to double the size of that port. So now we're looking at, and it's not pie in the sky. I mean, this is actually, people aren't feeling it yet because it hasn't trickled through. The contractors are feeling it because they're doing all the work. But by the end of 2024 and as mid-2025, when the first cruise ships come, people are going to start feeling there are 2 million new visitors going to come to this island. And that's going to become 4 million visitors by 2027 when they build the extra 2 berths. Now that really ticks so many boxes, and such a huge central box of, because it's Bahamian, having Bahamian operations there. There's never been done before. You know, Bahamian restaurants, Bahamian bars, Bahamian retail outlets. A lot of the ports, the private ports we've seen in the past, and that was the criticism of the cruise lines. They sort of gate it off, and the criticism was, you know, they keep all the passengers for themselves. Worse than that, a lot of times passengers don't even get off the boat. Maybe only 15% of them disembark. So the idea here was that you'd get, because it was so close to a beach, and it's going to be such an amazing, it's going to be one of probably their premier destination in terms of having a 7-acre lagoon. And the hope is that 85% of the passengers that arrive will actually get off the boat, will experience the Bahamas, the authentic. And the interesting thing as well is that the new average age of a cruise passenger is no longer sort of, 70 plus, or it's 46. Wow. These are young people. And and they've been surveyed. What do they want? They want cultural experience. They want experience and they want to understand the culture. So they are coming to see Grand Bahama, to become part of it. So that's why I see this as well as, and that's a whole other area of industrial development. The actual cruise ships coming into the Grand Bahama shipyard to be refurbished. The largest cruise ships in the world will be able to be lifted out of the water. That gives you tourism, it gives you retail, it gives you tourist dollars going straight into people's pockets, and good salaries coming from skilled jobs that are needed, in the Grand Bahama shipyard, and then other things happening. So I feel that we are on the cusp of really a multi-layered explosion of growth, something that we've not seen in 25 years. I really do believe that.
I'm just listening to you, and the level of optimism from someone who has seen so much is so very, very encouraging. Now, as all of this is poised to happen, and there is so much in the future, there is that elephant in the room that I'm going to ask you about. There is the current issue between the port and the government. There is almost a standoff of sorts over government's claims that the Port Authority owes some $300 million, I think, is the amount, and even the assertions that the port has not kept up its obligations. What are the implications of these issues for the future of this island, for the future of this city?
Well, I think it also feels like in some sense, a watershed moment, and we see these from time to time. Remember, in my father's era, there was no Ministry of Grand Bahama. This has come latterly. And so now you have the Port Authority and the Grand Bahama Ministry, often overlapping, often both doing some of the same things, or maybe not enough of the things that people are expecting, and you start to need to have a very strong working relationship to be able to piece it all together, and for there to be that comfort with the Port Authority working hand in hand with the government. Now, that's obviously the ideal world. That's where you want to be. What's happened recently? I think it was to some extent it's a natural consequence of the downturn in the economy that happened following the 2 hurricanes and COVID. People are struggling. There's unhappiness. There's just the prices shot up. And everyone wants somebody to blame. Is it the Port Authority or is it the government? Who's going to put this right? And of course, in many ways, it's out of everybody's control, as we know, because these forces, it just takes a lot of time to recover from force majeure. I mean, there is no magic wand, and I think it's a sad reality of life that the people who have some custodianship or who is seen to have that custodianship, whether it's that you're in the firing line, and there's only so much that can be done. Actually, our relationship, we should be building our relationship up to something even stronger, and not allowing these things to fracture it. I'm sure we'll come through it. There is obviously a certain sadness that goes with it, and because I lived here so long, I know everyone, and even the people that might seem on the other side of the table are friends. So, you know, you're not. I'm never going to criticize a situation, because I'm sure, you know, everybody has valid reasons for taking the actions they take, and you've got to play the ball and not the man, right? So there's a ball out there, and the question is this the path to resolving it? And I suppose when nobody can answer a question, it has to go to arbitration. Then it's out of everyone's hands, and the sort of the great wisdom out there of legalities and things will determine a situation. I don't, you know, I don't relish it. Yeah. I would love for it not to be the case. And certainly when you hear those figures thrown around, you know, there's nothing like that kind of money here, you know. So it's hard to see how that plays out. But for the moment, this is what seems to have been thrown at everyone, and we, I suppose, make the best of it and do the best we can to address it. But hopefully there will be no animosity long term, because it's, you know, it's important that we've all known each other too long for that. And certainly, you know, I will be here as long as I'm needed. I will be here as long as I'm wanted. Things move on, but it'll always be my home.
And Sarah St. George, I think that's a good place for us to end our interview. We have covered such a wide scope of topics and been able to get a glimpse inside the family history, even inside the life of the late Edward St. George. And I learned so much about your family and what Grand Bahama means to you, and some of the work that the port has done and continues to do. So happy birthday in advance, by the way. We wish you many more. And thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. It's rare that we get to sit and talk like this. So thank you. And I hope and trust that it's not the last time we have this conversation.
I hope so too.
Well, we hope that tonight's discussion has provided you with some great historical context and insight, not just into the establishment of the city of Grand Bahama, but also into the inner workings and history of the Grand Bahama Port Authority as well. The future of the city of Freeport is still being written in many ways. It is a community that has endured natural disasters for almost 2 decades, yet the people of this community continue to bounce back and show the resiliency that is unique to this island. We hope that you've enjoyed this discussion. We remind you that this is the first in a 2-part series. Thank you so much for joining us, and as always, we look forward to seeing you next time.